Hello, Luke.
My name is Frank Soma.
Hey, my name is Paul Bauer.
My name is Gigi Bowman.
It's Michelle from WeAreChange Calgary.
Daniel here.
Elise here.
Daniel Vincent Kelly here.
This is Chris Custer.
My name is Star.
Spencer, WeAreChange right here.
Hi, my name's Mike.
Stephen Monahan here.
This is Mike from WeAreChange Milwaukee.
This is a video response to
WeAreChange's video from Luke Radowski. He has apparently a one birthday wish.
His birthday wish was for everyone to make a video response.
But your question for your birthday was, if I could tell humanity or the world one thing, what would it be? And I said, well,
What I would tell the world?
I would say...
Alright. I can't tell you what to do. I can't tell you what's best for you. I can't tell you what's gonna save the world or anything like that. But
relax, think, slow down, and most of all, wake up.
Wake the fuck up and to be concerned about something much more greater than ourselves.
Turn off the fucking TV and take up a cause. Turn off Jersey Shore, turn off fucking Desperate Housewives, and take up a cause.
The world really isn't what it seems like, and what they actually are told in the media, for the most part, isn't really what's going on.
You know, we've been lied to through media, politicians, school, the entire freaking education system.
Our opinions and our beliefs can easily be manipulated by the mainstream media, and in today's society we're facing a crisis in what is right and what is easy.
You must think critically. You must apply your intelligence critically to everything you do, every action that you take, and every word that you speak.
So make sure you find the answers inside yourself
and come up with your answer, not somebody else's.
Please go and do your own research.
I'd say knowledge is power. Don't be afraid to seek it.
This next decade is going to be marked by instability. A lot of change is going to come. A lot of change is truly inevitable.
We have to plan for the future.
We know what's happening. We know what's going on.
We're on the wrong track. We should be working together and not seeing who can get the most out of who.
We are responsible for each other. Today, we've lost that same compassion, that love, that trust that we should have as a world community, no matter what conditions or circumstances come our way.
The only truth is that we're all in this together, with questions rooted in the very essence of our being, still unanswered.
Stop seeing separation. Stop seeing race. Stop seeing gender. Stop seeing sexual preference.
I do not care what colour you are, as your smile is universal. I do not care what religion you are, as it strengthens the light of a miracle. I do not care about your weaknesses, as it makes your strengths so remarkable.
Despite all of our differences, we rise and fall together as one.
It's up to each one of us to protect the civil rights and liberties of everybody.
Try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and realize that we are all human beings and that we all have one subjective goal, is that survival, basically, and also evolution.
And try to help this natural evolution concur or come to fruition on itself.
Get out there, meet new people, see new places, and expand your mind. Don't limit yourself to where you are and what you're doing. And don't think of people that you haven't met as strangers. Think of them as friends you have not talked to yet.
You're not as powerless as you think, you're not as weak as you think, and more importantly, you're not alone, you know? We're all part of this human experience, of this human tapestry, and that's something that should be celebrated. So live your life well, you know, love, forgive, and respect, but just never forget, you're not alone.
If we all want our freedom, we all need to treat each other with love, respect, and dignity, and make sure we look at everyone as each other's brothers and sisters.
We are all in this together.
love. Try to keep from smiling because it's impossible. Love one another.
Bring love back into the world. Stop fighting, going to war, hating each other. Come together as one.
There can only be wars if we pick up the guns and kill people.
We need more justice in the world.
Sometimes your paths will lead you to a fork in the road where on one hand there's life, love, and light at the end of that tunnel, and on the other hand there is darkness, death, and destruction. And we all want truth. So if I could say one thing, I would say, choose wisely.
Now is the time to choose negativity or positivity.
We need to take a stand together and be better.
We need to organize in the city centers, that everybody needs to come out into the streets.
We have to stop being apathetic to corrupt governments and just evil in general.
For us to know who the real enemy is and for us to stand up against them together.
Question authority and stand up to unjust governments and just follow your dreams.
Don't forget your humanity. Love is a strength, not a weakness.
Stop fighting and to start loving each other, because that's what really matters in life.
Love unconditionally and dance like there's no one watching, because death is the endless time of never coming back.
Try to do good for humanity because life is short. You don't have a lot of time here, so you try to do something positive, you know?
Nobody knows where we go for a fact when we die, but we all know that's coming. So while you're on this earth, if you spent all your time loving yourself, learning about who you are, what you're capable of, what we can do as an individual, the rest of the world would be grand, because everybody would be unique to themselves, to be completely and honest with your own self.
You are worthy. You are created to be masters of the universe. You were created to be something great, and that you have within you the ability to achieve greatness.
Remember who you are. You are infinite potential, infinite awareness. You don't have to follow the line of fear in your everyday life.
Your thoughts create your reality. We have so much more power over our lives than we've been led to believe. And once you realize this, you can begin to create the beautiful life that you all deserve.
Each and every one of us has all the power of the universe at our disposal. And the key is just knowing that. Once you know that, man, crazy things can happen.
To strive above the status quo, influence and inspire.
Never let hate guide you. No matter what happens, just don't give up. Keep going. There's nothing to lose. You know, all you can do is make a difference now. We're all one in this universe, and you have it inside you to make that change.
And until you know what kind of world you want to live in, it's never going to happen until you dream it.
Make the world a better place. Open your mouth and your ears.
That life is what you make it to be the change you want to see in the world.
You are the difference. You don't have to go out and be some hero or anything, but just get out there with your camera, with your cell phone, with your computer, and do what you gotta do to make this world a better place.
WeAreChange starts with you. You need to step up and make this evolution happen.
If you're looking for solutions to today's problems, look in the mirror. You are the solution. You have the power as a human being on this planet right now. Be the change you wish to see in this world. You hold the key.
Once you do that, you're going to realize that the only way you can't make a difference is if you don't try.
Listen to your hearts. And I wouldn't know what else to say.
Be happy.
Thinking about it, I at least made a small group of people smile. Hopefully I made some of them not feel alone, and maybe, just maybe, I made some of them think about life and what makes them happy for the rest of the day. I mean, who knows? The only thing I do know is that life is...
I will always remember Joel, and wanted to pay respects and tribute to an amazing human being
who was a stranger but became a good friend. Out of the goodness of
turn off the televisions and tune into the internet. Things are going to get really fun.